Hello, and welcome to my session on online engagement strategies. My name is Sarah Wood, and I am an educational technology consultant, and I love doing things that are creative. I love all things ed techy, and just kind of thinking outside the box and how I can use different kinds of engagement strategies to really pull students into the content. I have my social media connections up on the screen here, so feel free to connect with me if you would like, and I would love to see what you're doing in your world. As I know, video presentations can sometimes be hard to follow along with, especially if there's links and things like that. I'm just giving you the link to this presentation right up front, so feel free to follow along on your own as well as listening to the video. Sometimes I know it helps me be a little more present in the moment as I'm listening. So before we get started, I would like to do a little engagement activity. On the screen, you will see that I have two different links. If you click on that first link, I have a link to a Google form where I would like you to answer one question. That one question that I have for you is, what is something boring that you do each day? It might seem a little strange that I'm asking you this, but it will make sense here in a minute. So after you do that, you'll see, once again, going back to the presentation here, that there is a link where you can then view all of the responses that others have shared. And I do this because I feel it's sometimes interesting to see what people come up with. And just like with students, when we ask a question, we get all sorts of different answers. So it's just really fascinating to see what other kinds of boring things that people do in their lives. So like I said, where that question will make more sense here in a minute, this is where I'm pulling that in. So I think that in order to really tap into our ability to engage students in learning and connecting with them, that this really lies in ourselves being innovators. In this sketch note that's shared here, I truly believe in that number 1 and that number 8, and those being key things that are important as far as engaging with students and really building that empathy and also being reflective ourselves on our professional practice. So if you think back to my question of what is one boring thing that you do each day, think about how you could take that boring thing, be an innovator, and create a more engaging way to do something. And sometimes starting with ourselves and one simple activity that we do every day is a great place to start. So before we jump into the content, I would like to start up with a little warm-up activity, just kind of like what we do in the classroom. I have two different options for you here for the same activity. If you are more the unplugged kind of person, I have an option for you, but if you are the digital or kind of plugged in kind of person, I have an option for you as well. So what I would like for you to do, if you are interested in the unplugged version, is to take those 18 words or phrases that I have there and write them on small little pieces of paper. And I've done that myself here. You can see they're just small little pieces of paper, and cut them out. And then if you are doing the plugged version, I have a link there to a Google Jamboard in which you can do this activity. And what I would like for you to do is take each of those pieces of paper or digital sticky notes and sort them into whatever way feels right for you. So if you are doing the unplugged version, you have all these different sheets of pieces of paper here, sort them into ways that make sense for you. And then just leave it there out on your table or your floor, wherever you're at, and we're going to revisit that a little bit later here. If you're doing the plug version, same thing for you, but just keep that tab open as we'll come back to it a little bit later. So my big question for you is, what does engagement look like? I think we have in our head this visual of when we see, my students are engaged, this is what it looks like. But it might not be the same for the classroom next door. So looking at these pictures here, which one strikes you as showing a true picture of engagement? Spoiler alert, actually, all three of these show different kinds of engagement. So if we're talking about engagement, we can break it down into behavioral engagement, cognitive engagement, as well as emotional engagement. So when we're thinking about what engagement might look like in our classroom, as far as how we might think about activities that we can do, it's important to know that engagement can look drastically different depending on what you would like the outcome to be. And as said in the distance learning playbook, and that sometimes we need to look at engagement as more of a function and not necessarily a tool. And that was an interesting perspective for me, but it totally makes sense when I think about it. In the book, they break it down into finding information, using information, creating information, and sharing information. And I think how we choose to engage students through those as far as sharing information and content can be a total game changer in the outcome of what students take away as far as their comprehension level with the content. And of course, we all love a good tool, and I don't want to word vomit a bunch of tools at you because that can be very overwhelming and no one wants that. So if we're looking at how we can engage students in finding, using, creating, or sharing information, I have a chart here that will show some different tools that you can use in order to make those happen. And this is by no means a comprehensive list, but just some starting points if you're looking at how do I even get my students to start finding information, and then from that point, how are they going to start creating with the information that they found? This is a great place that you can reference as far as some tools for that. So moving forward, we've talked about some of those engagement functions, but what else that I think is super important is also looking at engagement as being almost a big structure. So if we have our engagement header up at the top, we need to have pillars that are holding up that big header if we're thinking of a building or a structure. So if we have our engagement up here, we can have 4 pillars below that kind of hold that up and really build up that engagement. So those pillars are intellectual urgency, emotional resonance, perspective bending, and aesthetic world. And in using these pillars, you'll start to see that much like the functions that they build upon one another as far as scaffolding the engagement that you would like your students to get out of the activity or information that you're sharing with them. So great, we have functions of engagement and now we have pillars of engagement. But like, what does this mean? It can be so confusing when you're having all this information, but I feel that it's super important to understand these as a base in order to truly create engaging activities or engaging with your students in ways that are meaningful. So yay, Sarah shared research, great! But, that's nice, but what does all this mean? How can we actually use what I've shared so far? So one thing that I've shared here is the 6 C's as far as a learner profile, and I feel that these are another level to that engagement. We have the functions, we have the pillars, and now we have the 6 C's. So we have 3 parts that kind of make up this big world of engagement. And sometimes the 6 C's are referred to as soft skills and might not be as necessary, but I truly feel that they are super important as far as engaging your students, getting them to communicate and collaborate and get the full potential out of your engagement activity that you have structured. So going back to our functions and pillars, how in the world do these even fit together? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I have a chart for you. So on this chart, I've laid out the intellectual urgency, emotional resonance, perspective bending, and the aesthetic world. But also we have how we can find information, use information, creating information, and sharing information. And holy moly, is that a lot of text for one slide. So let's just break it down and look at one particular column so that we can start to make sense of this. For this conversation, we'll focus just on the aesthetic world because that's kind of ideally where we would like students to get at. So this kind of gives us something to work towards. So if we're thinking about the aesthetic world and finding information, what might that look like? So if we're speaking of the aesthetic world and finding information, let's say you're teaching about animals and you're maybe talking about area and perimeter. Just throwing out some concepts here that you could potentially work into this. So think about it. If you are finding information, think about if a student visits a zoo or does a virtual field trip and they just become fascinated with an animal or something in particular that stood out about the physical space that they were exploring. So this might be a way for that they can start finding information, doing some research about maybe the design of exhibits. So if they're going to then start using that information in the aesthetic world, maybe they start using some mathematical calculations or charting data about exhibit sizes or animal populations, maybe even the actual sizes of animals, so they can have a better understanding of how these animals might live within this exhibit. So now they found some information, they've used some information. The next step is to start creating with the information that they found. So something that they could potentially do is create a virtual or physical mock-up of an exhibit that they've created. Using the mathematical calculations that they've done, they can chart out specs and write that out so that when they jump into the sharing of information, where they maybe share this with zookeepers or some sort of other authentic audience, that they have very specific information that they can bring to the table and explain as far as how they got this. And what's great about living in that aesthetic world is because students will be so passionate about what they're sharing that sometimes there isn't even need to have those note cards in front of them like, oh, this is what I'm sharing, is because they know this. They don't need to reference that. They have a visual in front of them and they could talk all day long about it. Because we're teachers and we love a good visual, I've kind of turned our chart with all sorts of text into a chart with now color and lots of text. So if we're going to look at as far as kind of gauging temperature, that first level of finding information is kind of where we're just kind of dipping our toes into the water, kind of gauging what does it feel like, what will this look like, and then as you go up as far as using or creating and sharing information, you'll see that that kind of gets a little bit warmer because students are engaged, they're into it, that they have an understanding, they're passionate about this, they want to learn more. So I wanted to provide that visual because I know I need a good visual every now and then to really help me make sense of this as far as how I want students to work through this progression. So how in the world does this look in the classroom? We've gone through our research, we've talked about the functions, we've talked about the pillars, we've talked about the 6 C's. So let's actually put all of that theory and that research into practice. So I'm going to show you some examples of activities that I've done with students either in the classroom or online, and as far as how I've engaged them using those pillars and those functions and the 6 C's. The first activity that I called Raid My Desk. And this was an introductory activity that I did with students when we were in a virtual environment where they couldn't physically be at where I was, and I couldn't be where they were. And to be honest, I wasn't at school at the time. I was teaching from home. So what I did was I created a virtual representation of my desk, and I love this virtual representation because it is way cleaner than what my actual desk is. So I highly recommend doing a virtual version of this unless you are on the tidy end and would be totally fine sharing a picture of your desk with students. But what I had students do was study that image and really kind of dig into it. I gave them, like I said, hey, I'm giving you full access to my desk. Go through whatever you see fit and kind of start to draw conclusions about what you might know about me as your STEAM teacher at that time. And so after students kind of explored the desk, kind of poked around, I then directed them to a Google form where they had to answer some questions about what was my favorite drink, what was my favorite animal. And I also gave them the opportunity to ask me any questions that I might have not addressed in the questions that I presented them in the quiz. So this was a great way at building relationships with the students. And then I also put on there for some questions for them to share things about themselves. I wanted to learn about them as much as they wanted to learn about me. So in looking at the activity engagement matrix, you'll see that this falls under the emotional resonance and using information. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll also notice that there's a pink apple with a little heart, and this is in reference to that very thing that we discussed at the beginning as far as what engagement looks like, as far as behavioral, cognitive, or emotional engagement, and this would fall under that emotional engagement. Moving into our second activity. This was about digital citizenship, specifically about identity and use. And let me tell you, there's nothing that gets kids quite excited like digital citizenship. No, they don't get excited. So I needed to figure out a way to really engage them in what I was sharing. And I did that through a culturally responsive approach as far as taking what was their actual interest. And in surveying them, I found out for whatever reason, 3rd through 5th graders were passionate about sharks. And so then, naturally sharks and digital citizenship went hand in hand. Odd combination, but it worked. I went with it. So for this one particular activity, what I had students do was use digital Legos or building bricks that I had created on a Google slide. So after our lesson, I had asked them to create a shark using those digital Legos, as well as a call-out bubble that asked them to share some advice about being a good digital citizen. So this not only engaged them as far as the content, but they were super jacked because it was about sharks, and that they were able to use something brand new, the digital Legos, because they were already familiar with how Legos work. So this was like, whoa, mind-blowing. So it worked out really well as far as engaging them and what I would like them to understand and know about digital citizenship. And how this activity falls in the activity engagement matrix, this definitely falls within that aesthetic world and creating. So simply by using a responsive approach to the content, it already jumps me into that aesthetic world. And by asking them to create something, not giving them something to replicate, it already put them higher up on that matrix there. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that picture of the brain showing that this falls within that cognitive engagement. I was really focusing in on the content and engaging them with that. Moving into my third example, this is when I did an activity about growth mindset. It's kind of an introductory activity to our STEAM class for the year, as far as it's important to have a growth mindset. It's important to fail forward, that it's all part of the process. We all make mistakes, and that mistakes are welcome. And I really wanted them to explore into that. And so what we did was we read the story, The Magical Yet, and then I had students use a digital choice board that I created, as well as digital pattern blocks where they could recreate some of these things that were from there. And it turned out to be a great experience as far as trial and error, failing forward, because they kind of struggled with using the digital manipulatives in the Google slide because they hadn't done it before. And so it made me so happy that they had that productive struggle with this. But at the end, in looking at that activity engagement matrix, this really focused in on that emotional resonance as well as creating. The students felt connected to it. They enjoyed the story, but then they also understood that it was important to fail forward, that it was okay to be frustrated as far as working through activities. And my last example I have to share with you is a computational thinking unit that I did that was focused around the theme of Minecraft. And this was another culturally responsive approach that I took based on surveying students about their interests, what gets them excited, what do they do outside of school. So even before we got into the content, when they walked into the classroom, they were like blown away, like, oh my goodness, we're doing Minecraft! And it was so exciting for them. And so I knew from the second that they walked in that door, their engagement level was high. They wanted to know what we were going to be doing. So how this unit was set up, it was set up as stations where students rotated through over a couple of weeks. And this was something that I had started in person, and we were able to get through several of this before we had our shutdown in the spring. But students had the chance to get through about most of these activities, and it was amazing to see them try so many new things and also use the computational thinking process as far as doing some problem solving and troubleshooting. And then as I was thinking about this and how things might go this year, I also updated it so that it could be done virtually, so that a lot of those resources transferred over. I had to kind of modify things, but I'm hoping that that engagement level is still just as high as it was in person due to how it was presented through the responsive approach and using Minecraft. In looking at the activity engagement matrix, you'll see up at the top, like this hit on the emotional, the cognitive, and the behavioral engagement, as well as different areas within the pillars and the functions. And the reason why I showed multiple check marks for this is because there were centers. It was hard for me to focus on one particular thing for this because there were 8 centers, and I couldn't say that this hit on one particular pillar or one particular function. But you can see, and just in that structure alone of using centers or stations, that it gives students so many different opportunities to be engaged in the content So even as they rotate through them, they'll find something that gets them excited, that they get passionate about, that speaks to them, where they'll want to start creating or using that information that they found. So what I would like for you to do is to go back to our first part of our activity when we did either our paper sort or our digital sort. Revisit that word sort. Take a look at how you had sorted things and maybe resort some of those words around. See how they fit together differently. So take a minute to do that. And then once you have them done, I'm going to give you a little challenge here. Pick one of your groups that you had selected as far as those words there and act on it. See what you can do with it as far as engaging your students. What does it mean to engage them based on those groups of words that you have? So if you pick just one of those and focus in on that, you'll start to see how those functions and those pillars start working into that, and that your engagement activity or how you're engaging with your students is going to be drastically different. So thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate that, and I hope that you have a great day.